Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for Transformative Voices, Educators for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We're so happy to have you. Tonight, we will engage a panel of education practitioners and activists in a critical conversation that explores what educators can do to promote and sustain equity for those furthest from it, which is particularly important in these troubling times. Our conversation tonight will be grounded in three essential questions. One, how might leaders intentionally build equity into their school? Two, how can leaders engage teachers, students, administrators, and parents in critical dialogue about race and anti-racism? And finally, what leadership challenges does the reopening of schools present, and how might we address them? Before we get started, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, and the Women's School Leadership Academy, a leadership development initiative for women school leaders with the courage and capacity to lead for justice in critical times. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Dr. Linda Rose, whose vision and leadership has made this important series possible. Thank you so much, Linda. I know you're on this call somewhere. So tonight we're joined by four education practitioners, scholar activists who are making good trouble in service of K-12 students and their families, teachers, and other education leaders. Dr. Peter Flores III is Director of Student Services for the Santa Maria Joint Union High School District and is Senior Associate for the Center for Culturally Proficient Educational Practice and Director of Equity for the Center for Leadership and Equity and Research. Some of you know that organization by the acronym CLEAR. Dr. Brooke Rios is Executive Director of the new Los Angeles Charter Schools. She created a program for white school leaders serving in urban public schools called Wake Up, which facilitates the process of racial identity development through critical self-reflection. We also have joining us tonight, Dr. Manuel Reston, who is a veteran high school history teacher in the Pasadena Unified School District and serves as chair of the History Social Science Subject Matter Committee on the California Department of Education Instructional Quality Commission. He was awarded the Milken Educator Award and is co-host of All of the Above, a video podcast that brings an unstandardized take on today's education landscape. And lastly, Ryan Smith is Chief External Officer for the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. He is former Executive Director of the Education Trust West and Vice President of Strategic Advocacy for the Education Trust. Upon election, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman, appointed Ryan to serve as co-chair of his Closing the Achievement Gap initiative. Pretty impressive panel, right? And I am Annamarie Francois, Executive Director of UCLA Center X, the Educator Preparation, Development, and Support Center in GSC-NIS, where I serve as a teacher educator. I am currently the UC representative on the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, board president for the Center for Powerful Public Schools, and I serve on the LAUSD Curriculum and Instruction Committee, and it's my privilege to moderate tonight's panel. So panelists, if we could see you, there you are, looking good. All right, so our audience really wants to know who you are beyond the bio, right? Who are you beyond the piece of paper in relationship to tonight's topic? So I have an introductory question for you, and I'm going to start with Manuel, but everybody get ready. The first question is, Manuel, what brings you to this work, and what does it mean to you to be a transformative leader?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank everyone for coming out. I'm brought to this work by my 18-year-old self, who was a freshman at UCLA on the heels of the passage of Prop 209. And that was a very difficult transition for me, coming from a very diverse community in South Sacramento to a very not diverse, elite public institution. And basically, ever since then, I've been working to try to break down those barriers that kept so many of my peers out of that same institution. And for me, a transformative leader is about the action. And that's why I'm in the classroom and in the field trying to do what I can to break down those barriers. I will let the academics, with all due respect, and theorists do that part, but a transformative leader is taking action. And that's why I joined the Instructional Quality Commission and started my own hip hop class and done a host of other things. So again, thank you all for coming out.
Thanks, Manuel. Same question to you, Brooke.
Thanks, Annamarie, and hello and good evening. Welcome to everybody who's joining us tonight. So I'm coming to this conversation tonight in the only way that I know how to approach this critical work, which is in the spirit of critical self-reflection, radical honesty, and humility. I'm a white person who's been leading in an urban public school for the last 12 years. And, you know, I came to this work for the reason that many of us do. I wanted to change outcomes for underserved communities. But I have to be really honest in sharing that when I reflect on my early years as a school leader, I had a little bit of the Michelle Pfeiffer and dangerous mind syndrome going on, or the white savior complex going on, wherein my whiteness told me that I could fix public education. And I've got to say that that really backfired on me. And as the result, I had to learn some really difficult lessons along the way. And those lessons informed my research at UCLA, and they inform my leadership every day that I engage this work. So for me, in light of the current and necessary uprising across our country, to be a transformative leader means examining each individual situation through a lens of racial equity, existing in an ongoing state of critical self-reflection on the ways in which my whiteness might be impacting my leadership, and empowering people of color to lead. You know, I think that for white people, we often grow up in race-neutral households and communities, and we really have to build the muscles of talking about white privilege and race. And this often means showing up in ways that are very contrary to white culture. But I think only by engaging our work in these ways can we make the changes necessary in public education. And specifically for me, this has meant empowering other leaders of color within our organization and recruiting and diversifying our board of directors.
Thanks so much, Brooke. I think we're going to have opportunity to take some of that up later on in the conversation. So Ryan, I'm going to turn to you now with the same question, you angelic troublemaker, you. What brings you to this work, and how do you define transformative leadership?
Yeah, first of all, I have to thank one of my favorite angelic troublemakers, Annamarie, Francois, and some of my favorite folks who do this work. I believe Manuel and I were at UCLA together when there was only there was 27, I think, Black men who were accepted on academics alone in a class of 4,000 students post Prop 209. So I think we were forced to really have a reckoning with how policies and practices and beliefs play out, particularly for communities of color. I'll say I started as an organizer at 15, knocking on doors, talking to other students in South Central Los Angeles about how we can get involved in making sure that the systems in education really exist for us. And that has been my career, is how do we shift power for those who are not usually at the table? How do we build new tables in order to make sure that parents, families, students are really engaged in the process? I think transformative leadership in this moment is being unapologetic. I like to often say equity is the new coconut water. It's the trend everybody's talking about, but not everybody's drinking. Now it feels like anti-racism is the new kale. Everybody is having a conversation about the importance of kale for the body, but without a real understanding of what all of these really complex constructs really mean for us. So I'm excited to have the conversation.
Glad you're here. And finally, Peter, you get the last word on this question.
I'm wondering if it has anything to do with age, but that's okay. I've taken the long road here. I think out of most of the other panel members, actually served for 25 years in the military, and then I came into education. And the one thing that I noted was that education hadn't changed very much. there was a lot of similarities with what I went through in public education, and some of the same challenges existed for a lot of the students that I got to know. And so I started recognizing that the students weren't the real issue. It just seemed to me that the real issue was the institution itself and the perspectives and the lens through which we see our kids and our families. I'm a firm believer that culture counts. You know, culture, I like to say culture eats process for lunch, right? So I think you can learn a lot from the culture of your school, of your organization. And all of my experiences since coming into education have been in high need schools with a very diverse student demographic. And so my cultural proficiency journey started down the path in my second school. And I have a lot of people to thank for opening my lens, because I had a very institutionalized way of looking at things. And so I think part of being a transformative leader is challenging the status quo, is challenging the institution itself, and challenging ourselves, because really, if we've been in this business, if you will, for a long time, we tend to have a very institutionalized way of looking at things. And where I've come full circle is I now see things less from a school-centric to more of a community and student-centric perspective. And I think that's where we really have to go if we're going to eliminate opportunity, equity, and the gaps that exist. So I'm happy to be here. I think I'm here by virtue of practice, by practicum. My practicum has got me here. And so I feel blessed to be here. And I just want to say thank you, Annamarie, and to the program, and all my panel members, and all those that might be listening in tonight.
Yeah. So thank you all so much, panel, for sharing your lived experiences and why you're here. I think it gives good insight for folks as they listen to your remarks from here on out and where you're coming from, right? And there's many different ways to enter this work, and all of it is important, particularly right now. So let's dig in. My first question is, how do we intentionally build a focus on equity into our schools and educational systems? And in particular, in your experience, what's worked, why, and what did you learn in the process? So I wonder if, Manuel, you can get us started.
Sure. To piggyback off of what Peter was saying, I mean, working towards equity has to start with connecting with the community and thinking about the community and learning about what the community wants. What I've learned in my journey is that a lot of times when people talk about equity, when it comes to marginalized populations, I've only taught in high schools with marginalized populations. A lot of times folks think to get that school performing, it has to mirror some of the higher performing schools that are more often white and Asian. So from my high school, John Muir High School in Pasadena, less than 2 miles away, we have La Cañada High School. My high school is almost entirely Black and brown. La Cañada High School is almost entirely white and Asian. And when our school got reconstituted back in 2008, we were really trying to mirror schools like La Cañada. We had a host of AP classes and all kinds of programs, and that helped us get more students into the UC system in particular. But a lot of our kids were going off to college and failing. And by connecting with the community, staying in concert with the community, we learned that we were actually failing those kids. They were telling us, look, the schoolwork at Muir was just easy compared to what I experienced in college. I just wasn't prepared. So under the transformative leadership of our former principal, now Dr. Timothy Sipple, we began the process of becoming a dual enrollment school, because having those traditional honors programs didn't really work for our kids. The teach to the test model wasn't what was best for our kids. So now we have dual enrollment courses, and we brought our local junior college, Pasadena City College, onto our campus. They built a satellite campus on our grounds, and now more of our students are taking dual enrollment classes and getting those credits and not having to be taught to a test. So for us, that's equity in terms of getting more of our predominantly Black and brown kids to college meant changing up our system and meeting their needs and not trying to mirror what other schools have. And it's going to look different in different schools. That's not what every school needs. So we got to get rid of this idea that equity means just like every school looking like those elite high performing schools, because that model might not be what's best for your kids. On my show, we interviewed Dr. Mary Helen Imordino Yang, who's a neuroscientist at USC. And she pointed out that, you know, a lot of times when trying to be equitable and trying to mirror the instruction of these so-called elite high-performing schools, that does a lot of damage, especially to marginalized students who need more support and need more humanizing curriculum than what you get in a lot of those elite schools. So gotta tap in with the community and build a school that matches their needs and their wants.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a good reminder, I think, for all of us that there is no one size fits all approach to almost anything in education. And the critical piece is knowing your students, knowing the families, knowing the community, and using the knowledge of what the current practices are to kind of shape a differentiated environment that's targeted specifically for your context. Brooke, I know you've thought about this a little bit. Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in. And I kind of want to highlight the difference between intentionally build equity and intent, two very different things. And I want to draw on some examples from my own research and experience. In short, to build equity into our schools, we have to be laser focused on the ways in which racism is permeating our schools and our society. And in my experience, it is absolutely impossible to do this when people of color are not seated at the table. In other words, white people cannot build equity into schools on their own. And in this country, 80% of school leaders in America's public schools are white. So there's a problem there. And, when we talk about making schools equitable places, we're talking about a system that was designed to forward privilege for white people, essentially. When you look at the history of schools, public, private, that is how they have really operated in this country. And I think it can really be challenging for white people to identify systemic racism because we've benefited from the systems. And so we may not see the ways in which those systems are harmful. And so like I shared, I want to draw on a personal example from my own work. And I've worked at UCLA charter schools for the past 12 years because of the organization's commitment to equity and social justice. I believe in this organization, and this organization has really done some incredible work in the community that we serve. We opened a middle school in Mid-City Los Angeles where there was no local public school. Students in this community had to ride the bus across the city to attend other schools because the local public middle school had been turned into a high-performing magnet, which is nearly impossible to get into. And so for years, as students were coming to the middle school, we had students entering who were at second and third grade reading and math levels, and we decided to open an elementary school. Today, that elementary school is embroiled in a pretty nasty racial conflict over Prop 39 facilities. And that's due to the way that Prop 39 is being implemented. And it's being implemented in a way where a school serving Black students has been pitted against a school serving brown students. And both schools who are serving historically marginalized communities are being oppressed, and nobody's winning. And students are hurting from this. So I think the big question is, how did a school like UCLA, with a strong commitment to equity and social justice, a school that's serving a community of students where 85% qualify for free and reduced lunch, where at this point, I think 98% of our students are non-white, how did we find ourselves in this situation? And I stepped into the executive director role about a year and a half ago, and I've spent a lot of time engaging in critical self-reflection over this very question. And I think what I've come to understand is that while our intentions were really good, we did not do some of the necessary actions that are required when you're looking at building equity into schools. For many years, our leadership team and our board members were mostly white. And these were leaders who were dedicated, who were brilliant, who were absolutely committed to the students we serve. But I believe that our whiteness actually created some blind spots, and it prevented us to see clearly how the situation was unfolding right before us. I think that we failed to build key relationships in the community that we were placed in because our ultimate goal is to relocate the elementary school near our middle school. And, you know, we really intended to tread lightly. We wanted to make little impact on our co-located school. We chose not to recruit from the community and to accommodate where we could. But the problem with that is that, as Manuel spoke to, engaging the community is a core tenet of culturally responsive school leadership. And we completely missed the boat, even though our intentions were good. So for today, New LA is doing some things differently. You know, we're continuing on an aggressive search for our own independent site because we don't want to rely on Prop 39. We don't want to rely on a program that essentially positioned us as colonizers on the campus of another public school. You know, I'm pleased to say that our leadership team and our board will never look as it once did. Currently, 50% of our school leaders are people of color. Our board has been diversified. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory team on our board that looks critically at issues of race that are evolving within the organization. And, you know, for me as a white person who's trying to navigate the path forward for our organization, one thing is very clear to me. There's a lot that I don't know, even with my doctorate from UCLA, but I have the right people around me who have the wisdom to advise my leadership, or quite frankly, who can lead on their own. So, you know, in short, I think to build equity into our schools, the commitment to equity really needs to be woven into the fabric of the organization. It needs to inform every decision, every hire. And, you know, schools are really a key vehicle for forwarding racism in this country. And we cannot continue to operate in ways that are racially neutral or ways that reinforce white privilege.
So Brooke, let me ask you quickly, your comments really touch upon white privilege. And one of our audience members wants to know if you can describe how you tackle this with your white colleagues.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And pretty strategically, you know, we started having some designated conversations about this issue. I think all of the leaders at our school, when our school leadership team was predominantly white, recognized that there was a problem with that and definitely wanted to change that. And so we had time set aside where we really dug in. And each one of those leaders made their own commitment to their racial identity development and their journey as anti-racist school leaders. And that meant that work didn't stop at the office. It meant looking critically at home lives and how we are living outside of our organization. It meant looking at some systems within the organization and disrupting those systems. It meant diversifying our leadership team, diversifying our board. And so there was a very intentional commitment to setting aside time for those people to do the work that needed to happen in order to change the course for the organization.
If I can jump in there to add to those comments, I think the key word in the question is intentional. And something that we did in our district was bringing in cultural competency training. And that cultural competency training does make one aware of blind spots that you may have, and particularly blind spots relative to power and privilege. Also, as an educational institution, public education, again, kind of going back to what I commented on being very school-centric. I think part of learning about cultural competence is both the culture of us as individuals, but also the culture of our organizations. And so I think that you have to have that input, and Brooke, you know, spoke to that. Getting the community's input is critical to moving the equity work forward. And the only other thing I'll say about equity work, equity without action is really not equity. Equity requires action. It requires systemic change. And so back to Ryan's point about it's kind of like the flavor of the month, it's getting thrown around a lot. Equity requires action to where systems are changing because of it. Curriculum is changing. Our approaches to parent engagement is different. Something that I talk about, and I might mention later, is the difference between parent involvement and parent engagement. And so, it just really does require a paradigm shift to kind of take a step out of our comfort zone and start allowing for other perspectives to enter the room. But really, really great points, Brooke.
Yeah, I think now people are educators and leaders in every area of the system are really grappling with how do we create a culture, how do we create structures, what kind of professional learning do we need in this particular moment in time. And I think that I want to turn to Ryan, and I want to say that part of what we have to do is develop our knowledge and understanding, but also be in critical dialogue with one another. So Ryan, how might we discuss race and anti-racism with teachers, students, administrators, and parents? And how have you shaped these conversations to surface kind of the individual, institutional, and systemic racism that has just become so transparent of late? And what have you learned along the way? I know that's a big question, but you can handle it.
Yes, and I know you've given me a time frame because I'm long-winded, so I'm gonna try to be short on this, and I think it's gonna be important. First of all, I appreciate hearing Peter, Manuel, and Brooke really talk, I think, unapologetically about issues of race. I think there's been a lot of webinars, there's been a lot of conversations, particularly in theory, about how you may tackle anti-racism. I will say this, I had a conversation with a middle school student named Ranjat this last week. And we were talking about how we can have conversations around equity. It was a webinar. And he mentioned one about his participation in protest. He talked about his experience with gun violence and being an immigrant to this country. And the one person who had really friended him was a young Black male student who unfortunately became a victim of gun violence where he lived. And he tied that with seeing some of the deaths due to the spread of COVID. And he just eloquently said, I want to do something different. And it reminded me that our students who we engage with in the spring, when they start in March, they're going to be very different students when they come in fall. Our conversations around student agency, student empowerment, have to really bring about what student voice is, how we're really going to engage conversations that are important. So there are a couple things I think are important tools here that we should discuss. One, I'm really appreciative of Glenn Singleton and others' work around having courageous conversations around race. And I have a link that I'll share in the chat. It's a good, quick article on how do you start to have a conversation with your colleagues, with students, with community around race when you've never had that conversation before. Another thing that I think is really important, Ibram X. Kendi is having amazing conversations now, but he says America wants to heal racism without pain. And he says that's similar to trying to heal yourself of cancer without going through potentially chemotherapy. We have to recognize harm in our conversations around equity and anti-racism, where there's been systemic and institutional racism, but where we've been a part of a system that unfortunately has disadvantaged students, undereducated students, has not prioritized students who needed us the most. And without that recognition of the harm that we may have caused, it's gonna be really hard to have authentic conversations about the work. I'm really excited because today I work for the Partnership for LA Schools. We support 19 LAUSD schools in Wattsboro Heights in South LA, and we had a big professional development called the Summer Institute. 300 educators this morning were in a conversation around anti-racism and its connection to college readiness and success. And one of the things that we talked about is what's your equity lens and what's your anti-racism mirror? Like, how do you think about curriculum and how it should reflect the true lives of our students when we're thinking about how we teach? How do we think about data? And not just data that will wash over your ears about disparities, but how data could really inform practice, particularly the equity gaps that are so stubborn. So there are a number of things that I think we can do But the start of the conversation is a reflection, a mirror about the harm we may have caused, the harm the system may have caused, and also thinking about how we can start courageous conversations with our colleagues, our students, and others in this moment. So I'll share some of those resources, but I think now is the time to have those conversations. It's not the time to shy away from them, particularly as protests may subside, as headlines may go away around Black Lives Matter or thinking about brown students. We have to be diligent in continuing these conversations within schools and within the systems that we support.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is right now, while it's painful, it's also an opportunity for us to move forward in this work together and to bring along allies or co-conspirators in this work. The thing that, and this is brought up in some of the comments in the Q&A, there are two things that I too worry about. On the one hand, I worry about as we push educators to come to know their students and see them as cultural beings and utilizing what you learn and know in your practice, how do you avoid essentializing? How do you avoid this becoming a beyond heroes and holidays? You know, how do you move beyond heroes and holidays, I should say? And then on the other hand, and this speaks to what Brooke was saying and some of what you said, Ryan, is how do you have these conversations with white folks in a way that for white folks who are not quite ready, but we're not ready to wait? And those two are real questions. So have at it, y'all.
Yeah, if I could speak to that. First off, I think a lot of it is just having this idea that anything related to race and racism is additive. Like, you keep the curriculum as it is, but then, oh, we also got to learn about, we got to sprinkle in some Black and brown experiences in there. And that additive approach does a lot of damage. So I prefer the decentering whiteness approach. On my show, we interviewed some folks who teach in Minneapolis, and we asked them about teaching in the wake of those George Floyd protests, because the protests were literally happening in their community, in their neighborhood. And they talked about their predominantly Black and Southeast Asian population and how they work to decenter whiteness from the curriculum, so that it's not, so that anything dealing with racism isn't looked at as just like Black History Month type cultural celebration type of situation. And then, California wise, so, I as a history teacher have long had problems with our history curriculum. Our history standards in California have not been updated since 1998. So I joined the Instructional Quality Commission at the California Department of Ed, and now we're pushing through the Ethnic Studies model curriculum as a statewide model of curriculum for schools in rural areas, urban areas, to learn about the experiences of people of color, and also the oppressive mechanisms of the systems that keep folks marginalized. And in that process, and that curriculum has not been approved yet, because there's a lot of pushback, because there's hurt feelings, and because folks think that it's doing too much or it's too political. And what I found is that it might be for a lot of old folks hearing terms like cis-hetero patriarchy, or hearing that there's white supremacist culture embedded in schooling, that might seem radical, but for a lot of young people, that's not radical at all. And you could just look at what happened in June. I mean, those are young folks out there, and to them, something like saying Black Lives Matter, that's not a radical statement, that's just plain truth. But to a lot of other folks, that's deemed radical and political. So we got to invite the young people to lead the way, because they're ready, and they're ready right now. And we can't be concerned with hurt feelings, and we can't be concerned with always centering the experiences of white educators in these discussions, because predominant student population in California is not white, and we have to center our students more so than anybody's particular feelings.
In answer to your question, Annamarie, is how do you not confront it now? I mean, it's on TV, it's in front of us. We feel it. There's two pandemics. There's COVID and there's racism. It's alive. It's here. I would submit that something that I do, that I use in confronting that scenario is I use counter narratives. I use my own story. I can speak to my own story better than anybody else can. I can talk about, how growing up, I grew up on a border town, and I wasn't Mexican enough to belong to Mexico, and not American enough to be in America. So I think being able to establish the potential for dialogue. Dialogue, you have, you're either going to have that conversation with your staffs, or they're going to have them out in the parking lot. And when they have them out in the parking lot, it's not serving the organization any good. And so I think that as educational leaders, we have to bring that to the forefront. It's messy work, but you know what? You have to start somewhere. And I'll share an experience of something we did in our district. Is we brought in the tools of cultural proficiency, manual for school leaders. And that got the conversation going, and that taught us how to have dialogue. And from there, we moved on to inviting Dr. Robin DeAngelo. She came to our district, 10 years ago. Could I have envisioned her coming to talk to us? No, but you have to broach it. You have to be able to talk about it. If we look at our California teaching standards and our administrator standards, it's to me, it's like we're just doing what our standards require us to do. And to Manuel's point, let's talk curriculum, ethnic studies. Long time coming. My district recently, proud to say, passed a ethnic studies graduation requirement. A lot of pushback, but I guess, I got to a point when we were dodging the elephant in the room, when I finally said, I've been dealing with this all my life. So if it's time for other people to be a little uncomfortable, well then, it's time. Obviously you want to have a skill set. You want to do your homework. You want to know how to have breakthrough questions. You don't want to put people on the defensive, but you also don't want to stay quiet. You don't want to collude. When you hear these comments, you want to address them. And I'll tell you, for me, there was plenty of opportunity with plenty of comments that I heard, that when I finally decided that I'm tired of hearing these comments, it's time for me to speak up. Guess what? Things started getting better, and I started getting better at addressing them. You have to practice it, but I think that if you go in it with good intentions or positive intentions, that I tend to believe that most people in our profession have that blind spot, then are really racist. That's what I believe. I think most people have ideologies and have institutionalized thinking that just hasn't been opened to other, to a wider perspective. That's what I really think.
So I'm going to ask this very quickly of y'all, because I want to make sure that we get to the last question and get to some of the Q&A. So let's imagine a world where, folks have gone through the pain of their involvement in racism. We get beyond that. And so what's the next step in repairing the harm that racism has done to the educational system? What's the next step? And I'm going to thank Sarah Seinfeld, who's on this webinar, for raising that question. It's a really important one.
I'll just say this, and I think it's connected to our last conversation. When I think about policies, beliefs, and practices, to Dr. Flores's point, there are belief gaps, and I think and those belief gaps are going to be uncomfortable. We can have implicit bias trainings, all that type of stuff to try to bridge those gaps. But there may be a time where the majority of people who may be racist, who may not believe that Black and brown children can achieve at high levels, may not come with you. And I think we have to continue to interrogate belief, but I think we have to focus on policies and systems in the interim. What are the policies within our school sites, within our districts, that disadvantage Black students, disadvantage brown students, disadvantage English learners, disadvantage students from different sexual orientations and backgrounds, and attack those policies? For example, when we started the partnership for LA schools, we did an assessment of students who were enrolled in gifted and talented programs. No matter what you think about gifted and talented programs, we looked at Watts and found out that not one student, within the schools that we support in Watts, not one student in Watts, period, was actually enrolled in gifted and talented programs. When we asked LAUSD why that was the case, their response, Annamarie, was not that we made an oversight. They said that not one student in Watts is actually gifted and talented. Where we said, well, you know, if you believe in math, that's statistically impossible. Clearly, there are some gifted and talented. If you believe in the brilliance of all students, clearly there are some gifted and talented students in Watts. So we tested every second grade student across the district for gifted and talented programs. There was a 12% increase over and beyond the average district student. The biggest jump was for young Black men. When we went back to many of their teachers, they said, you know, these men we thought were disengaged in the content. We never thought that, well, maybe it wasn't rigorous enough. There are policies like that that have existed for decades in our system that we just call bureaucracy, that we say that's the way it is, that we say it's always been that way, and absolutely do not give a fair shot. So when we talk about equity, to Dr. Flores' point, we're talking about action. We're talking about shifting resources. Everybody's for equity until you take something from one community that may have more and say, hey, what about this community that has less? So how do we think about resource equity? How do we vastly shift the resources that we have from some communities that have been under resourced for years? How do we think about curriculum equity, to Manuel's point, and really creating curriculum that uplifts the lives of our students? I think we have to get aggressive about beliefs, but really about policies and practices that hinder student success.
And I would add that we need to get really serious about the fact that our work is political, and it is not politics neutral. The way we engage in the world, the curriculum that we implement, the way we implement it, or the way we develop or don't develop relationships with our students and our parents. The times when educators were technicians and they just had a bag full of best practices and that's gone. And if you can't see yourself as a political being and political educator, we're not going to address racism in classroom. It just won't happen. So thank you for that. I'm gonna, I wanna ask one question that is specific to the moment, because we know that there's been talk about schools reopening as early as next week locally. And so I wanna ask that question and then maybe come back to a couple of the questions that we weren't able to embed in our responses prior to. So Peter, can you talk a little bit about what the equity challenges are, what are the equity challenges, the leadership challenges that reopening of schools present, and how might we address them?
I think the greatest leadership challenge we have for reopening schools is wanting to go back to normal. I think that if we're coming in with that perspective, we're missing the moment. I think that what we have to do is be very intentional of looking at, to Ryan's point, our policies and our systems and how they can better serve all our students. And this is the moment. I mean, if virtual learning has done one thing really well, it has really shown a light that inequities continue to exist. And so I would say that the biggest challenge is us wanting to return to normal. And the way that we need to counter this is to be intentional on our reopening. Something that we're doing in our district is that, in addition to the professional development for strategies for the virtual learning environment, we're actually being very intentional with addressing the Black Lives Matter movement. We're talking about race and racism. We're talking about microaggressions. And we're talking about them to our students and to our families. But our teachers, as everybody knows, needs to have that professional development, that training on how to lead those conversations. Because sometimes, even though we have good intentions, those good intentions can actually do more damage than good. And so we have to be very strategic as to how we go about doing that. In conjunction with that, I think we have to, as leaders, because this is about leadership, I think as leaders, we have to move from being transformational leaders to being transformative leaders. Being transformational leaders is more about school improvement and trying to work within the existing framework. Transformative leaders is more about challenging the status quo, critiquing the institution, and trying to make schools as they should be to better serve all students. So this has been really challenging for us as leaders in education, but at the same time, let's look at it as a great opportunity in the moment to be able to tackle those huge barriers that have prevented students from achieving at high levels. And, so I think the reopening needs to be a move away from the traditional. I've had conversations with, well, why are we still talking about a 9-month school year? Maybe it should be year round. Maybe the starting time should change. Maybe it should, have other components that we haven't thought about. But the biggest point I want to make about the reopening is this. We are in historical times. This is the time to set it straight, to really look at our systems and our policies and reevaluate those policies in a way that, to be quite honest, the situation we're in gives us permission to do. And so I think that our mindsets have to change. I think that we have to take a more social justice approach to our leadership. And I think that if you're not including your parents and your students and your community into this new reopening, then I think you're going to find yourself, really trying to fix things than if you were, having done this planning with them in mind to begin with.
Could I jump in real quick on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll be honest, I'm worried that because there's so much focus on the reopening conversation, the fight for racial justice and that energy that we had all summer, I'm really worried that that's going to go to the wayside. I entered the classroom as a teacher in fall of 2004, and education it's always felt like the sky was falling on us. It was no child left behind, and get those test scores up, otherwise we'll be shut down or reconstituted. And then it was the Great Recession and layoffs after layoffs and years of trying to just survive. And then the shift to Common Core and trying to get acclimated to a new set of tests and trying to get that right. And now, of course, it's the pandemic. And always these have been excuses for not really focusing enough on cultural competence, on culturally responsive pedagogy, on racism in schools. And I'm really worried that that's what's going to happen now. Like, we're still trying to sort out the bell schedule. We don't have time for, how we're going to incorporate anti-racism in our curriculum. Well, that'll wait. And I'm really worried that that's going to happen, and it cannot wait. And I love what the Pac-12 football players did yesterday in releasing a list of demands of what they want to see met before they go back onto the field, because they know, yes, it might be a pandemic, and yes, that's the focus right now, but that doesn't mean racial justice goes to the back burner and has to wait. So they're fighting, and I think schools and transformational leaders need to fight for that as well, because we just can't wait. I mean, James Baldwin, whose birthday just passed, he asked, how long am I supposed to wait for your progress? It took my father's time and my mother's time and my niece's time and my brother's time. How long am I supposed to wait for progress? We can't wait anymore. So those conversations around anti-racism, they have to be ingrained and embedded in everything that we do. If all we do is just take our traditional curriculum and digitize it for online learning and that's it, then we've done nothing really. So those conversations need to continue, need to be centered, but I'm worried that they will just fall to the wayside.
I think a lot of us are worried about that. So as organizational and school leaders, how do we prevent that from happening? How do we keep the eye on the prize when external forces are asking us to do exactly what you're saying, Manuel, you're afraid of? What do leaders do?
I'm going to chime in on this, Annamarie. I think that, it goes back to that first question and that word intentionally. And I think we have to intentionally make the space for those conversations, and it's not optional. I know, at my school during distance learning in the spring, when our country entered into, again, this critical time where there was racial uprising, our teachers made intentional space to have conversations in advisory. They intentionally incorporated that into their curriculum and made space for that in their classrooms, made space just to process with students. And, you know, I think that sometimes teachers come back at that and they say, you know what, I'm not a guidance counselor. I don't know how to have these conversations about race. And if you're a teacher on this call today and you're scared of that, I want to say to you, you have to start building that muscle, because teachers cannot be race neutral in America's schools right now. And race neutral means that we pretend that race is not something that's impacting our systems and our schools, because that is how privilege is forwarded. When we say that we need to focus on how to do this distance learning schedule, and we don't have time to have this conversation about a major shift in our country, that in itself forwards privilege. And if you're a person who's wondering how to do that, and if you're scared of doing that, I'm going to share some resources in the chat, but you know, request professional development from your school, educate yourself about anti-racism. You know, you can affiliate with a group. There's a lot of white anti-racist groups like Aware LA, where you can start having those dialogues about race in safe spaces if you're afraid to do that, because you've got to build that muscle and you've got to be able to model and facilitate those conversations for your students.
I work very closely with a school in LAUSD, and I'm not going to name the school because I don't want to get anybody at the school in trouble. But one of the things that the school leader did, and it's a school that serves primarily Black students, it's in a historically Black neighborhood. The teachers are amazing. Many of them grew up in that neighborhood. They, you know, they're teaching at that school. They're very invested in this kids. And they got a new principal a few years back. And one of the things the principal did is she just kind of unapologetically said, we're serving Black students, we're moving this curriculum to be more Afrocentric, period. We are going to have book study instead of regular professional development so that we can really dig into kind of the theories and the good thinking about what does it mean to be anti-racism? What are the implications of racist policy? And doing that kind of professional learning together that's very targeted on issues of access and equity, and then expecting to see it in classrooms and then bringing back and listening to the voices of the teachers who are on the ground doing the work. And I can tell you that my grandchildren, God willing, will go to that school, because this is something that I see leaders in other schools saying, I can't because the district is saying we have to do professional development on this. I can't because, you know, we're leaders. We have to take risks. What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to put out there on the table in order to work for justice in public school? So, I mean, I wanted to share that example, especially if my colleagues at that particular school are listening. I want you to know that we see you and you are a model for the rest of us. Ryan, you're dying to say something. I can see you going like this.
Oh, I was probably just amen cornering you a little bit, like, amen. I appreciate that. You know, the only thing I would add is, you know, people are talking about Congressman John Lewis in good trouble. I think of Bayard Rustin, no relation to Manuel Reston, although I did ask, about every community needs a group of angelic troublemakers. I will say this, to your point, we can't be people who are fighting for equity and racial justice and be very concerned about being liked, about not causing trouble, about their, you know, I just don't want to make waves. Because that work requires that. It requires us to absolutely put some skin in the game. I've really appreciated everyone's comments, but I will say this for Brooke. I think Brooke is having an honest conversation with white folks who have a lot of power and education, that you have to be a co-conspirator. It's not enough to be an ally. It is someone who you are giving up power and privilege in order to empower other communities. And I'll say for POC folks, definitely in education, that we can't be paralyzed by white discomfort. Mm-hmm. We can't. We just can't, because to everyone's point, there is a moment right now where we can have unapologetic conversations around race, and that opportunity window may close one day. So I think as we think about the new school year, we have to be unapologetic about the needs of Black students, the needs of Latinx students, the needs of English learners in a way that just speaks truth to power. And if it's not now, when? I'll end with this. We've talked about a lot of, men, but I will say, Fannie Lou Hamer, amazing civil rights activist in the South, said to white women in a room who really fought for feminist issues that nobody is free until everybody is free. And I think our collective self-interest is in the ensuring that once we really pay attention to marginalized communities, then we're talking about liberation for all folks, including our students.
So I'm just going to go ahead and drop the mic on this conversation on those final words, Ryan. I think that we all are amening to you right now. I do want to say to the audience that we see your questions. Unfortunately, we're coming upon the end of our conversation. We could go on for another hour or so. This may be telling Linda she needs to schedule another webinar to take up some of these issues. I also want the audience to know that we're going to go through the questions that were not embedded in the responses provided by the panelists, and hopefully one of the panelists will be able to respond to you directly. And we just want to really thank you for being here on behalf of the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and the Women's School Leadership Academy, to Dr. Flores, to Dr. Reston, Dr. Rios, soon to be Dr. Smith. I just want to say to be in good company with you all makes me confident that we're going to win this. We're going to win this fight. This struggle will not end as long as we continue the work, the good work that came before us and that we're in right now. So thank you all so much for being here. Take care, and we will see you on the other side.